Alright, how's everyone doing today? So starting off with this portion of the video, I gotta create a pocket for this mountain scenery. I'm gonna do that outwards by 0.02. I'm also gonna do an outline trace by 0.02 along the elk boundary. Don't forget about those inners in some of these subjects that you're trying to create. Now, this is just the scale of the model height for the 3D toolpaths that I had set for this project. I just kind of went with the default setting here. Here I'm going to show you why I chose the absolute minimum when it came to the 3D smoothing profile for this toolpath. It's just because I wanted a more realistic mountainscape, and since there was mountains and trees, it looked more realistic to me. Anyways, back to creating this pocket for the mountains. I'm going to use this vector trace, take these nodes to the outside of my workpiece, and then connect the dots. And make sure it somewhat resembles the state of Idaho, and we're good. Then I'll just recenter it back to the project, double check that the text and the mountains don't collide with one another. Overall, this is what I want the project to look like. Don't mind the ugliness. I decided to go with an offset on the raster toolpath of that 3D mountainscape. So let's get to carving. I'll start with the elk and make this out of Sapele. Overall, this portion of the carve took roughly 3.5 hours using a flattening toolpath for the surface, with a 1/4 inch downcut bit, finally wrapping it up with a 1/16 ball nose bit. So when it comes to this mountain range and the elk, I actually got it for free when I purchased my Vcarve Pro subscription. I believe it was Wildlife Scenes, the elk scene, but it's been over a year, so I don't know exactly remember what it was called, or if on the Vcarve website that Designed and Make still offers this collection. Moving into the 48-hour time lapse of this mountain carve, it was a series of X and also the Y rasters for that 3D roughing toolpath. First with a 1/4 inch end mill, and then coming back over with an 1/8 inch end mill for that second raster. The second 3D roughing toolpath was also done with an ever so slight offset just to keep the jagged lines for those two subjects, thinking that mountains and trees in my vision are meant to look rough and not meant to look clean and smooth. So when it comes to this part of the project, I would just carve a few hours at a time, press pause on my machine, cross my fingers and pray to the CNC gods that there wasn't a power spike or a loss of power. I managed to at least take note of every time I would pause. I would write down the line that my CNC was on, just in case I ever had to rework the G code in for this project. To be honest, I also did finally cave in on some things for this project. The first of the two being a Dremel, just to get into the finer details of the trees. Use that to help bend the trees to become more pronounced. Oh yes, a lot of you I'm sure are saying, well, can't you just make a toolpath with your CNC? And I'll say yes. This was my first time making a 3D carve, and I learned a lot of lessons, and this was one of them. At this part of the project, I just didn't have the time to re-edit just the tree portion of this unified mountain and tree landscape. Getting back into it, I ran that original vector outline toolpath, and now I'm trying to free. Now getting into this pocket profile, I had to cut up some 1x4 stock in a slightly bigger profile than I needed for this project, which I made an error. By not adding a 0 to 0.2 when I came back to this disaster I had created, I had to alter the pocket toolpath back to being slightly shallower. So now the pocket toolpath is complete. I'll smack these mountains into its pocket. Here I used a bag of concrete thinking it would do the trick, but later on I had realized I had some uneven glue pressure issues. So here's your tip on always to remember even gluing pressure. Thought I would have learned that with the several cutting boards I had previously made. This part of the project is where it starts to get a little dicey. Here, since I don't exactly have an even surface to mark out a Z-depth, I'm also switching router bits. I'll take each pass and mark the depth on a scrap piece of lumber for a reference point. I also realized when my machine was off, I had readjusted my X position because the auto lock wasn't engaged on my machine. So if you ever come across this problem, the first step would be when you first start your project. I usually mark out my datum. Once you set your XY home for a project on your CNC, turn on your router, then manually slowly plunge, just so you can go back and have a saved reference point, just in case. Now, given in this instance y never moved, it was only my x, all I would have to do is slide my x position over while I have the corresponding bit that I used loosely inside the collet. Once the bit drops, you know you have found your x or y. Just keep in mind it's not the be all end all tip, but it should bring you back to what you had. Starting off with a 1/4 inch end mill and finishing off the finer details with a 1/16 inch end mill. Now here's another lesson I learned, is to double check the vectors for this .02 offset for this elk pocket. Notice the one up in the antlers and then also in the hind leg. I'll clean them up with an X-Acto knife. Finally moving out of the end mills and moving into the V-bit realm, I'll carve out the text needed for the sign. Now I'll just go ahead and clean up the insides of text with some sandpaper and poly around the text. Later on you'll know why. Picking up the X-Acto knife again, I'll just clean up the shavings on the inside of this V-bit profile. I had seen some makers in the community use this scorch marker and wanted to give it a whirl. So I applied it to the text and loved it. This was the reason why I applied poly around the text, to prevent burn bleed out or leaching during the burning process. I'll also sand away this overburn. I originally was asked to use a slab with a live edge on it, but it just wasn't going to work. Again, I'll break out my brand new Dremel and clean up the bottom edge along with using it to roughen up the opposing side. I also used the thread of a screw and a wire brush just to liven it up a bit, showing off the bare edge pre-stain. I later on used a mix of golden oak and dark walnut, but this was after I had taped it off and applied poly. If you're still here from the beginning, this is the second big boy purchase I made, an electric Wagner paint sprayer. I decided to buy a paint sprayer because I wanted a nice clean finish, where if I went with a brush, it still would have that brushed on look. Great for trim around the house, yes, but for this project, nah. Another method would be a roller, and I just didn't want that orange peel look, and that's when I knew I wanted to bite the bullet and buy a paint sprayer. First couple of times using it, I have to say I'm thoroughly pleased. I did notice you have to keep an eye for the clogging around the nozzle area, and it does seem to kind of have a little bit of an inconsistent spray pattern at times. But for under the 150 budget, I'm still pleased with the performance and still couldn't have asked for a better overall finish. I'm gonna go clean out the paint sprayer and hope everyone enjoyed this project. Catch you all on the next trail. Cheers!